Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Please consider subscribing and check out our Patreon for more. Enjoy the video. Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The clock on the nightstand read 2:37 a.m. Next to him, Barbara was sound asleep, softly snoring. How he envied her ability to sleep through their latest argument. Earlier that evening, they had fought again over money. Ever since Mark lost his job at the auto plant, Barbara seemed to find a new thing to criticize him for every day. At first, it was little comments about him not helping around the house enough. Then it was complaining that he wasn't being proactive about finding a new job. But lately, the jabs had gotten more personal. "What kind of man just sits around all day while his wife works?" she had shouted over dinner. "No wonder they let you go. You don't have any drive anymore." Mark had tried to stay calm. "I'm doing the best I can, Barb. I've had some interviews that seem promising. The economy is just bad right now." "Don't give me that excuse," Barbara snapped. "Plenty of people are finding jobs, but they're not lazy slobs like you." He clenched his fist under the table. "I am not lazy. You have no idea how hard I'm trying." "Oh, really?" Barbara retorted. "Because all I see is you drinking beer on the couch every day. I guess going to a few interviews a week is just too much work for you." Mark threw his napkin on his plate. "I've had enough of this. I'm going to bed." Barbara yelled after him, "Running away again, huh? Yeah, real manly behavior." And so they had gone to bed angry, with Mark fuming on his side and Barbara making a point of going to sleep with her back turned to him. As Mark lay there, recalling the fight, he knew he couldn't take much more of this. The cruel jabs, the lack of empathy or support from the woman who was supposed to be his partner. It was slowly crushing his spirit. He had tried to be understanding of Barbara's frustration. He knew it couldn't be easy for her, suddenly having to be the sole breadwinner. But he would never speak to her the way she spoke to him. He would never make her feel so worthless. With a sigh, he rolled over and looked at his wife's sleeping form. Even in the dim light, he could make out the hard set of her mouth and brow. She almost looked angry, even while unconscious. Anger seemed to be her resting state nowadays. Slowly, an idea began to take shape in Mark's mind. He couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. Gingerly, he eased himself out of bed, trying not to disturb Barbara. He tiptoed over to the closet and pulled out a duffel bag. Moving quietly around the room, he began packing his essential belongings, some clothes, toiletries, important documents. He got dressed, pulling on jeans, a t-shirt, and his old leather motorcycle jacket. Zipping up the now full duffel bag, Mark took one last look around the bedroom. Though he and Barbara had shared this space for nearly 15 years, it held no sentimental value for him now, just bitter memories and a feeling of defeat. Hoisting the bag over his shoulder, Mark walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Within minutes, he was packed up and rolling his motorcycle out of the garage as quietly as possible. The night air was cool and damp, matching his melancholy mood. As Mark straddled his bike and kicked it to life, the rumbling motor seemed to shake off some of the weight that had settled on his shoulders. This was the right decision. He could start over now, find a new job, maybe a new town, but most importantly, find a new sense of self-worth. Barbara had taken so much from him, but she couldn't take his dignity. Not unless he gave it up willingly, and he was done doing that. Mark took one last look at the dark, silent house. Then he slipped on his helmet, revved the engine, and peeled out down the street. The road ahead was uncertain, but it had to be better than what he was leaving behind. Mark took a deep breath of the cool night air. For the first time in months, he felt free. He had no real destination in mind. He just knew he needed to get away. Away from Barbara and the constant nagging. Away from the stale routine of his life that was suffocating him more and more with each passing day. He needed this time on the open road to clear his head and decide what he really wanted. Mark had always loved riding. It had been his escape since he was a teenager. But once he got married, the bike spent more and more time gathering dust in the garage as life's responsibilities piled up. Over the years, Barbara's patience with his hobby had worn thin. She complained that he cared more about that stupid bike than her. Maybe she was right. Or maybe she was just jealous that the bike gave him a sense of freedom that she never could. As Mark cruised down the empty back roads, the first rays of sun peeked over the horizon. It was a new day, and he finally felt hopeful for the first time in years. No more walking on eggshells in his own home, no more senseless arguments that left him feeling drained. He breathed in the fresh morning air, the faint smell of pine trees filling his nose. For the first time in a long while, he felt fully alive. Mark's stomach started to rumble. He realized he hadn't eaten since the meager dinner he'd hastily thrown together the night before while Barbara was out at one of her community meetings. He always preferred to avoid her as much as possible in the evenings. Every interaction seemed laced with tension and resentment lately. Up ahead, he spotted a tiny gas station and diner nestled amongst the trees just off the highway. He pulled up next to the single pump and filled his tank. As he replaced the nozzle, the bell on the diner's door jingled merrily. Mark glanced up to see an elderly man wearing a trucker hat shuffling out with a newspaper tucked under his arm. The man gave Mark a friendly nod before climbing into his pickup truck and driving off. Inside the diner, Mark slid onto a stool at the counter. Everything was quintessential small-town charm: black and white checkered floor, red leather seats worn from years of use, tin signs advertising Coke and RC Cola. The smell of bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. An apron-clad waitress immediately approached him, pot of coffee in hand. "Morning, hun. What can I get you?" she asked cheerfully, already filling a mug for him. Her name tag read Sally. "I'll take the breakfast special over easy eggs and whole wheat toast," Mark answered. "Coming right up." Sally gave him a wink and turned to place his order. As Mark added a splash of cream to his coffee, he felt his shoulders relaxing. It was so peaceful here. No one knew him or his troubles. The other customers chatted casually with one another, discussing the weather or gossiping about the new grocery store that had opened up down the street. It was all so wonderfully normal. Mark's food arrived steaming hot, the smell making his mouth water. He dug in eagerly, savoring the flavorful food. Sally kept his coffee topped off, and he found himself lingering after the last bite was gone. He didn't want this moment to end. Finally, he paid his bill and left a generous tip for Sally. Back on his bike, he lit up a cigarette and took a long drag. Barbara had made him quit a few years back. "Those things will kill you," she had nagged. But today, he didn't have to worry about her disapproving glare. The midday sun warmed Mark's skin as he continued his aimless journey down Route 66. He had always dreamed of driving the entire length of the Mother Road on his bike. He and Barbara had even planned to do it for their 10th anniversary, but she had come down with the flu that week and refused to reschedule the trip for later. Just another extinguished dream. Cruising along Route 66 felt nostalgic, like traveling back in time. Many of the small towns had retained their retro charm, dotted with quirky roadside attractions and diners. Mark imagined what it must have been like during the route's heyday in the 1950s, when families packed up their cars and set out for new adventures out west. Anything seemed possible then. By late afternoon, Mark had crossed from Illinois into Missouri. His beard scruffed from a long day's ride, but he had no desire to stop yet. For dinner, he grabbed a burger from a roadside stand manned by a teenager who looked utterly bored by his job. Mark envied the boy in a way. His whole life still ahead of him, not bogged down by the burdens of a failed marriage. As the sun began its descent, Mark stopped at an outlook to stretch his legs. The rolling Ozark Hills sprawled before him in the golden light. He leaned against a wooden fence and took in the view. Out here, surrounded by nature's beauty, his problems back home seemed to fade into the background. When he arrived in Springfield, Missouri that night, Mark decided to find a motel instead of camping. He was exhausted. The Royal Inn was a bit worn down, but decent enough for a night's sleep. The older gentleman at the front desk reminded him a bit of his grandfather, who had passed a few years back. They chatted amiably about the unseasonably warm weather while Mark checked in. In his room, Mark peeled off his clothes that reeked of cigarette smoke and sweat. The hot shower felt like heaven, washing off the grime of the road. He sank into the lumpy mattress, not even bothering to turn on the TV. The faint sounds of traffic outside his window were oddly soothing. He felt more at peace than he had in years. The next morning, Mark devoured some runny scrambled eggs and limp bacon in the motel's breakfast area. It wasn't the best meal, but it would fuel him for the day ahead. He nodded a goodbye to the kind, grandfather-like clerk and headed out to the parking lot where his Harley waited gleaming in the sun. Today, he turned south, entering Oklahoma. This was the farthest he and Barbara had ever traveled on the bike together. They had taken a long weekend trip out here the first summer after they had wed. Those were happy, carefree days, before the steady creep of resentment had seeped in, eroding the foundation of their marriage. Mark tried to push aside those bitter memories and focus on the open road ahead. He drove for hours, stopping occasionally for gas or food. The endless fields and big open sky made him feel small, but also strangely free. Like his problems didn't matter so much out here. Late in the afternoon, he veered off Route 66 and followed a dusty back road where an old hand-painted sign advertised a swimming hole. He was hot and sticky from the ride, so a dip sounded refreshing. He parked the bike under the shade of a sprawling oak and stripped down to his boxers. The swimming hole was fairly secluded, surrounded by lush forest. An old tire swing hung from a rope tied to a tree limb. Mark plunged into the cool water with a sigh of pleasure, rinsing off the grime of the road. After his swim, Mark lay back on a large, flat rock to soak up the late afternoon sun. The heat felt soothing on his sore muscles. His mind drifted to Barbara again. He wondered if she had tried to call him yet. Part of him felt guilty for just up and leaving the way he did, but he knew if he hadn't, he might never have found the courage to actually go through with it. This trip was supposed to help give him clarity, but instead his emotions were as muddy as the swimming hole's riverbed. Had he made the right choice leaving? Could he have tried harder to save their marriage, or was it a lost cause from the start? He wished he knew the answers. Mark stayed at the swimming hole until dusk began to fall, reluctant to leave this peaceful oasis. But eventually he dressed, straddled his Harley, and headed off in search of somewhere to hunker down for the night. He ended up at a place called Bell's Inn, located on an isolated stretch just off the highway. It was no 5-star hotel, but the room was cheap and there was a bar attached where he could grab some dinner. After devouring a steak cooked just how he liked it and downing a few whiskeys, Mark was starting to feel pleasantly numb. The alcohol softened his jagged emotions and slowed his racing mind. He found an old blues song on the jukebox that reminded him of a road trip he and Barbara had taken back when things were still good. Back when the silences between them were comfortable instead of loaded. Mark stayed at the bar until last call, chatting with the bartender about sports and trying not to stumble up to his room. He missed the comfort of his own bed but was too exhausted to care. As soon as his head hit the flat pillow, he was out like a light. The next morning, Mark awoke just as the first rays of sunlight began to peek through the curtains of his motel room. He blinked a few times, momentarily confused about where he was. The faded floral wallpaper and musty scent of the room were unfamiliar. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back. His hasty middle-of-the-night departure, Barbara's shrill accusations still echoing in his ears. The long stretch of open road he'd put between himself and his old life. Mark sat up and scrubbed a hand over his stubble-rough cheeks. After over 20 years with the same woman, he felt like a new man, a free man. His growling stomach reminded him that freedom came at a price, though. He was going to need to find some breakfast. After a quick shower, Mark pulled on his jeans and leather riding jacket. He made sure he had his wallet, room key, and sunglasses before heading out the door. The morning air was already warm, promising another hot day ahead. Mark strode across the parking lot and gave his motorcycle an affectionate pat. The classic Harley-Davidson Fat Boy was his prized possession and had been his sole traveling companion so far. "Mornin', beautiful," he said. "Let's go find some grub." The rumble of the engine shaking beneath him never failed to lift his spirits. Mark pulled out onto the street and within minutes spotted a quaint little diner called Emma's up ahead. A flashing neon sign in the window advertised breakfast specials. Country music drifted out onto the sidewalk whenever patrons entered or exited. Mark parked and swung off his bike. The smell of sizzling bacon, brewing coffee, and cinnamon enveloped him as soon as he stepped inside. Despite the early hour, the diner was already bustling with customers. Mark grabbed a stool at the counter. A smiling waitress named Amy appeared with a steaming pot of coffee. "Good morning, hun. Passing through?" "Yes, ma'am," Mark replied. "You gotta recommend something good for breakfast." "Everything's good here, but you can't go wrong with Emma's famous lumberjack breakfast. 3 eggs, ham, bacon, sausage, hash browns, pancakes, toast, and jelly." Mark grinned. "Sounds perfect." As Amy went to put in his order, Mark glanced around the diner. Nearby, a family of 4 was cheerfully digging into waffles and omelets. An elderly couple shared a newspaper over black coffee and toast. A pair of leather-clad bikers sat near the door, likely on a road trip themselves. Mark felt his earlier tension and anxiety melt away. He was just another nameless, faceless traveler passing through this sleepy desert town. It was strangely liberating. "Here you go, hun, Emma's famous lumberjack," Amy announced, sliding an overflowing plate in front of Mark. "Can I get you anything else?" "Not right now, thanks." Mark's mouth was already watering. He dug in, savoring the flavors and textures: crispy bacon, fluffy pancakes, savory sausage gravy. It was just what he needed after a long day on the road. Mark was sopping up the last of the egg yolk with his toast when Amy reappeared with the check. "So where are you headed?" she asked, clearing his empty plates. "Nowhere in particular," Mark said with a shrug. "Just wanted to get out on the open road for a while, clear my head." Amy nodded knowingly. "Well, safe travels, and don't be a stranger if you're ever passing back through." Mark left cash to cover the bill, plus a generous tip. He felt re-energized and ready to get back on his bike. Consulting a map, he decided to continue following the old Route 66 southwest. His plan was to just ride until he felt like stopping again. No schedule, no commitments, no one relying on him. Just pure freedom. Mark spent the next several days meandering through small towns along the Mother Road. Mark stayed in cheap motels and ate in local diners. Mark rode down Route 66, the wind whipping through his hair. After 2 straight days of riding, exhaustion was setting in. His eyes struggled to stay open, and his body begged for rest. Up ahead, Mark spotted a tiny gas station, the first he'd seen in over an hour. He pulled up next to the single pump and killed the engine. As he filled up his tank, the front door chimed and a young woman emerged carrying 2 bottles of water. "Hey there," she said with a smile. "Hot one today, huh?" Mark nodded, squinting in the harsh sunlight. "Where are you headed?" the woman asked. "Nowhere in particular," Mark said. "Just going where the road takes me." "Sounds nice," she said. "Ever been through these parts before?" Mark shook his head. "First time. Figured I'd check out Route 66. "Well, you picked a good time. My name's April, by the way." She extended her hand. "Mark," he said, shaking it. April was slender and petite, with wavy brown hair that fell past her shoulders. She wore cut-off jean shorts and a faded Grateful Dead t-shirt. Mark paid for his gas and grabbed a few snacks while April made small talk with the clerk. Back outside, April turned to him. "Since you're new around here, can I offer you some advice?" "Sure," said Mark. "There's a great little town about 20 miles up ahead. They've got a bar and grill with live music on weekends. You should check it out." Mark pondered the idea. A cold beer sounded pretty good after the long day's ride. "Tell you what," said April. "I'm headed that way too. Why don't we ride together?" Mark hesitated. He preferred solo journeys, but April seemed harmless enough. Plus, he didn't really have anywhere to be. "All right, why not?" he finally said. April's face lit up. "Awesome, my truck's around back." She led him to a dusty old pickup. Mark climbed onto his Harley and followed April back onto the Mother Road. True to her word, after 20 miles, they came upon a small town. It was little more than a main street lined with buildings, but charming in its own way. April pulled up next to the only bar in town, the rustic Radiator Cave Saloon. Inside, the place was dimly lit and nearly empty. A few patrons sat at the bar nursing their drinks. April and Mark grabbed a table. "So what's your story?" April asked after they'd gotten their beers. "What brings you all the way out here?" Mark took a long swig before answering. "I guess you could say I'm going through a bit of a midlife crisis." He told her about his failed marriage and toxic relationship, how he'd finally gotten the courage to walk away from it all. "So here I am," he said. "No home, no plan." April listened intently, her brown eyes filled with empathy. "Well, we all need a fresh start sometimes," she said. "At least you're finally living life on your own terms." Mark nodded. That was certainly one way to look at it. They sat chatting and listening to the jukebox for a while. Mark felt himself starting to relax. It was nice to have some company on the lonely desert road. After her second beer, April's eyes lit up as if she'd suddenly had an idea. "Hey, want to have some real fun tonight?" Mark shrugged. "Like what?" "The band that usually plays here had their van break down a few towns over. The owner's been looking for someone to take their slot." "And?" said Mark, confused. "And we should totally do it." April could barely contain her excitement. "I used to play gigs all the time back in the day. I bet between the two of us, we could throw together enough material for a set." Mark laughed. "I haven't been on stage since my high school talent show." "Ah, come on. Where's your sense of adventure?" she prodded. "When are you ever going to get another chance like this? It'll be a blast." Mark shook his head, amused by her enthusiasm. Truth was, it did sound kind of fun. A crazy way to break out of his routine and add some excitement. "All right, let's do it," he finally said. "I'm game if you are." "Yes!" April squealed, high-fiving him. "We're gonna kill it, I just know it." She skipped over to the bar to pitch the owner on their impromptu gig. To Mark's surprise, he readily agreed. April returned with a huge grin. "We're on in an hour, let's go prep." In April's truck, they hashed out a set list of classic rock covers that Mark knew reasonably well. He felt a twinge of nerves, but April's confidence was contagious. She really believed they could pull this off. Mark stepped out for some air before the show. Under the starry desert sky, he shook his head and laughed. What was he doing? Busking at some podunk bar with a girl he'd just met. It was crazy, irresponsible, and so very freeing. Back inside, patrons were gathering with curious looks, chatting about the unexpected live music. April did a mic check, then turned and winked at Mark. "Let's give these folks a real show," she said. Mark nodded, adrenaline pumping through his veins. It was go time. They kicked off with an upbeat rendition of Born to Run. Mark started tentative but grew more confident as the song went on. April's voice was strong and soulful, earning cheers from the crowd. By the third song, Mark was really getting into it. Under the lights, letting loose with the music, he forgot everything else. No more stress or heartache, just this moment. The acoustics in the small venue were surprisingly good, amplifying his voice. Mark belted out Reeling in the Years with a passion he'd never sung with before. April shot him an impressed look and mouthed, "Nice." Mark felt on top of the world. They covered everything from the Eagles to Tom Petty, with April flawlessly taking the lead vocals. Mark held his own during the duets, harmonizing better than he thought possible. As they neared the end of their set, April said, "For our last song, I want to try something special. Do you trust me?" "Sure," Mark said with a shrug. "Just go with it then." She turned to the crowd. "How are y'all feeling tonight?" The audience whooped and cheered. "You know, my friend Mark here has never performed as his true self. But I think it's time he finally embraces his inner diva." Mark looked at her, baffled. "What are you talking about?" "Tonight," April declared, "we're going to transform Mark into Marlene, a lovely lady with the voice of an angel. What do you say, folks?" The crowd went wild. Thanks for watching. Check out Patreon if you want to have early access to the other parts. If not, it will be online in a couple of days.